Even though the New Mutants was released a few weeks ago now, I have only just got round to making my X-Men ranking. As many of you know, before the MCU became this Marvel franchise, which was very popular and it still is to this day, and recently they released the last X-Men Fox movie, even though it's a spin-off, the New Mutants. I'm going to rank all 13 of those movies. Coming in at 13th and last place, we have X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now, I really struggled to find anything good with this movie. It is a horrendous movie, especially given the budget it had. This was their attempt at making a spin-off series within a series and focus on mutants' origin story. So they started with everyone's beloved Wolverine. Some of the writing, dialogue in this is so lazy, so many plot lines are very cliche, and they chuck in way too many characters just to expand the mutant universe. One of the most famous but horrible things about this movie is the CGI, most noticeably in the bathroom with Wolverine's claws. They look like completely unfinished CGI and it looks absolutely awful, but there's no excuse for when it was made, because prior to this, Wolverine's claws had looked very real. We'd had glimpses of Wolverine's origin in previous movies, but it was somewhat of a mystery. Now that we've seen this, we kind of wish that we hadn't been told. It would have been left as more of a mystery, as what they do kind of ruins the character a little bit. Just like all X-Men movies before this was PG-13, so bringing in Deadpool for it, they weren't going to change the rating to have Deadpool be who he is in the comics. They did the lazy and unforgivable thing of sewing his mouth shut so he couldn't shout out any crude humor or language. They made him the most overpowered mutant ever, which portrays what happens in the comics. So overall, a complete mess of a movie despite its huge budget. Coming in at 12th place, we have the newly released The New Mutants. Now, this one was never going to be the best X-Men movie. It was a spin-off with very small cast in a small containment facility. It was to try something different. Obviously, this was meant to come out a long time ago. Instead of being the last Fox X-Men movie, it was meant to come out, I believe, before or after Logan. So they were just trying to experiment a little bit. And by experimenting, they did when they brought in some horror elements, which were by far one of my favourite things about this movie. It made some really interesting decisions with how it brought in those horror elements, and some of them were pretty creepy, most noticeably for me. I believe they're called the Smiley Men, just how you couldn't really tell their expression, they didn't have any eyes. I just found that very creepy, but I wish they had more of it. There's a serious lack of horror elements and, to be fair, any action at all. Whenever it looked like there was going to be their powers on display, it cuts away, or in other scenarios where they could use their powers, they just decide not to for no reason at all. The real standout from this movie was Anya Taylor-Joy as Ilyana Rasputin. She really gave it her all and she did a great job. Even though she was meant to be a dislikable character, you couldn't help but enjoy her performance and therefore enjoy the character. Keeping on the line of actors, I wasn't too impressed with Maisie Williams' performance. I know she's loved a lot by everyone from her role in Game of Thrones. I wasn't too impressed with her performance here. It felt very dull. And same too with Blue Hunt's performance. You know, the main character, you want someone interesting, someone you care about, but I just couldn't with her. Overall, you could just feel this movie had a lot of re-editing, which it did, and it doesn't really use the horror elements to its potential. Therefore, sometimes it can be quite a mess of a movie and uneven, and that's why I have it so low down. Coming in at number 11th, we have X-Men Dark Phoenix. Now, I just have to say, this isn't the end to the X-Men franchise that they deserved. You know, there have been some real highs in this whole franchise. They didn't deserve to go out on one of the lows. Although saying that, it isn't the worst movie, it just has a lot of things which aren't memorable, which aren't too amazing, but it doesn't have really anything that is awful. Like, it really does have some cool X-Men action, some mutant action spread out through the whole of this movie, so it's very consistent on that front, and has a great final act scene on a train, which actually was a reshoot. But the main problem here for me is the characters. Now, we know Jean Grey is meant to be acting different as she is overcome with the power she has gained, but she feels more normal than some of the main characters, most noticeably Raven and Charles, especially Charles. I've always loved him, I love James McAvoy, but I couldn't stand him in this movie because the character was written to be so selfish, arrogant, and couldn't own up to any of his mistakes. And also, Raven just moans the whole time. But keeping on the point of Raven, her makeup here is so lazy. You know, they've done such a great job in previous X-Men movies, but in this, I feel like they just took her head and dunked it in a bowl of paint and then said, alright, action. There was no effort put into it at all, and for me that just sums up this whole movie. It doesn't feel like there was too much effort put into it, because on paper these are some of the hugest stakes, but they feel tiny because there isn't too much emotion, because they've made it so you don't care about the characters because they're not given much development in this movie, or if they are given time on screen, they just undo what they've developed in previous movies. It's their second attempt at the Phoenix Saga, and they've messed it up 2 times, also by going down the same path as The Last Stand, and also it's not really helpful when you have some very cliche and unforgettable villains. Coming in at 10th place, we have X-Men The Last Stand. Yeah, this movie's disappointing. It's meant to be the big end to a trilogy, but it's not as bad as everyone actually says. It has some interesting plots in there, you know, about the mutant cure, but then again, it also has too many plots. You watch through this movie and you count out all the plot lines, you know, the mutant cure, Magneto's brotherhood, there's some silly love triangle, which was relevant in this movie, and then to top it all off, one of the biggest plot lines in the X-Men comics, the Phoenix Saga, is introduced when they really didn't need to do that. As I mentioned in my individual review, they should have devoted a whole movie to the Phoenix Saga, and I was wrong, they still couldn't even do that one right. But I really like the inclusion of Kelsey Grammer as Beast, or Hank McCoy, in this movie. He had that nice peace between the humans and the mutant, and continuing to develop throughout this movie like it had in the previous 2 movies. I love the relationship and respect that Magneto and Professor X still have for each other despite being enemies. But this is one of the movies where there is so many cringy and poor moments. Most noticeably, I can think of the Juggernaut. You don't really feel as attached to these characters, and the ones you do, they just kill off with no second thought and not a moment devoted to them to evoke any emotion. It just happens, and then they're like, oh yeah, they just got killed off, and you're like, oh wait, they actually did? Like, the tone created in the previous 2 movies is absent here, and it feels like a completely different movie, like a generic comic book movie with just some stakes, not as high of stakes like they had built up in the first 2 movies. Even though they're minuscule compared to what this is on paper, those ones were executed much better and felt huger. Coming in at 9th place, we have X-Men Apocalypse. Now, I'm a big fan of how they used the new rebooted characters in this. They also gave them more development than the original trilogy, which I found with Jean Grey and Cyclops. I could care about them more, as I didn't know them too well in the first one, it seemed. And this movie has some powerful scenes with Magneto. Michael Fassbender does once again a great job in this movie. The scene in the forest is very, very emotional, one of the more emotional scenes in the whole franchise, and we even get to see an even better Quicksilver scene at the mansion. So great to see him back. Even though he didn't have a huge role, he did have a bigger role, but it didn't feel too forced. But this movie still does have its problems. It has pacing issues. It has a very slow first half where can lose interest and not really care about what happens, and on paper, thus far, this is probably the hugest stakes they've had. This is the end of the world they're talking about, but the main villain, Apocalypse, doesn't feel menacing at all. He feels very corny, like he's out some 90s video game, or he's a 90s video game villain or something like that. The way he just shouts to the sky, it's all very cliche. Didn't get that. You know, this is like the Thanos of the X-Men, so you're meant to feel huge stakes, huge consequences, but he just feels like, we already know he's gonna die. So in the final act, and not even just that, a lot of this movie you feel a real absence of emotion, and that's why even though the final act was heavy on action, it didn't feel really that entertaining. Coming in at 8th place, we have The Wolverine. Now, like I said in my The Wolverine review, I think this is one of the more underrated X-Men movies. Only shame is that it's this low down is because there are some great ones ahead. Just overall, it's nice and simple. Puts Wolverine in different environments, so it's bit different, more unique than what we had seen. We just get a nice simple adventure with Wolverine, and we get to see him go full Wolverine like we hadn't done in any movies before this. We normally see Wolverine go solo, or when he had to work with the X-Men, but never have we seen him just paired up with one person where he has to protect them. We see that later on with another movie that's in this list, but we'll talk about that later. I just loved all the scenes, how they mixed in the Japanese environment with the bullet trains, with all the katanas. Just everything looked very cool, very unique compared to not just on other X-Men movies, but comic book movies in general. So it was really a breath of fresh air for this one, and it gets more hate than it deserves because I think it's truly a very underrated X-Men movie. The only problem is things get quite silly in the final act with the Silver Samurai, but for the majority of this movie, I really enjoyed it. Coming in at 7th place, we have X-Men, the one to kick off this whole franchise. It has aged pretty well for an early 2000 movies. You look at the other comic book movies around that time and they're very campy. You can't take them serious, but this is one where it started taking into that direction where you can take it seriously. These movies can feel real even though they contain a lot of unrealistic elements. So this one is a landmark for comic book movies, so as it changed the genre completely. And I actually have to praise the special effects for this time, because I've seen much worse special effects in this franchise in some of the more recent X-Men movies than this one, which came out in 2000. The casting is on point here. You know, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen and Hugh Jackman, they made history with these roles. And I just love how everything's introduced to us. You know, all the mutants, how the humans discriminate them. Only real complaints is, although they've got rid of a lot of that campiness, it's still present in some scenes, and the plot itself is pretty standard. Coming in at 6th place, we have X2 X-Men United. Now this is how you do a sequel. Now the first movie explained everything, so we now understand what this world is like, so in the second movie they can just pursue everything without having to explain everything again. Has one of the greatest comic book movie openings with Nightcrawler, and once again has some great action, especially with their mutant powers. Now the campiness is pretty much wiped out from this whole movie, and just the relationships of all the characters is very amusing and feels very real. It takes a different direction to what people might have expected with Professor X getting kidnapped. You know, I would have liked to see him more in this movie. He's kind of sidelined. That's one of the few things I don't like too much about this, but for what they were going for, it really works. Coming in at 5th place is Deadpool 2. This movie has a lot more emotion than the first one, mainly because you see what happens earlier on in the movie. And despite all the change behind the scenes, you know, there was a lot of replacements with director, crew members. The action is just as fun, just as violent. The humor is just as good as it was in the first movie, so it doesn't feel like anything has changed, and that's what the main structure of the first movie success was built on. So they kept that here and they made another good movie. Once again, I just love the humor, as I said, the references, how he breaks the fourth wall, and the great cameo from some of the X-Men characters and even Brad Pitt. The first movie they didn't try too much to connect to the other X-Men universe, but in this, although you could say they're trying too hard to create another team up within a superhero franchise, I liked how he created the X-Force as it's accurate to the comics. Questions were asked whether Josh Brolin would be any good in this movie, as he was cast as Thanos, and it was a bit weird that he was in 2 Marvel movies in the same year. Although 2 different characters, he was great in this movie. I would like to see him continue as Cable in the MCU, but that could be difficult with him being Thanos and everything. And also Zazie Beetz being cast as Domino was huge fun. She had a very fantastic scene. One of the main things that you just love about this movie and the first one is it just feels like Ryan Reynolds is playing himself and he's just written the movie himself. So that just allows a lot of freedom and it feels very refreshing. The one negative, you could say the plot is quite cliche with some of the elements, and you could say they also go way out of their way sometimes to try and get laughs. Not everything lands, and they're constantly trying to make jokes. Sometimes it can get a bit tiresome. Coming in at 4th place, we have Deadpool, perhaps the biggest risk in the whole X-Men franchise. As we know, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, they messed up the character Deadpool in X-Men Origins, and they kept Ryan Reynolds. He wasn't the problem in the first one, but there was a huge risk making an R-rated, the first R-rated one in this franchise, devoting it to this character who hadn't been done justice before, but they absolutely knocked it out of the park. Gave one of the most refreshing and hilarious comic book movies. The action is superb, although violent, which is why I love it so much. It doesn't hold back, and even though this is still in an X-Men franchise, which is watched by a lot of younger people, they don't hold back on this movie with the humour. As I just mentioned, the action, just all of it is very severe and violent. Although the plot is simple, it's very fast paced and enjoyable because we love this character Deadpool, and they're not afraid to mention past mistakes, whether that's in Ryan Reynolds' career, take a diss at DC, or in their own franchise. So I absolutely had a blast with this movie. It's superb. If you haven't watched it, you've really got to. Coming in at third place, we have X-Men Days of Future Past. The stakes have never felt bigger. They involve time travel with it, going back to the past, confronting the past of people you know nowadays but not knowing them back then. And I just loved how they introduced the first class characters with the older generation. They mixed together nicely. It's just nice to have a universe feeling this big. Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, they absolutely knock it out of the park, as do Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart. And you know what, just everyone was great in this movie. I absolutely adored all the performances, and it does itself the favour of correcting any past mistakes in this franchise, which they can go on to kind of undo as well in later movies, but focusing on this movie, it's constantly moving, constantly engaging. It brings in a new character, Quicksilver. He's not overused, he's only in it for a small bit for what they need him for, which produces a great scene. It's not as heavy on action, which people might not enjoy as much, but the scenes without action are just as gripping. Coming in at second place, we have X-Men First Class, one of the stranger ones to be announced, but what they did with it was absolutely superb. I absolutely love this movie. It expands upon Eric and Charles's origins, and you get to see how they were close and how they become distant from each other, but James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender absolutely knocked it out of the park with this movie. The way their characters communicated, how their emotions bounced off one of another. It was an absolutely superb performance from the two of them. They really carried this movie forward. I love how Charles always tries to calm Eric down because he's a bit of a loose cannon with his emotions from what he went through in his childhood. And they make this really real feeling comic book movie. They don't try and adapt it and cut corners so it is ideal for kids. You could appreciate this much more when you're older because it feels very real and some of the things are superb. There is a tiny problem which bothers me, but it's understandable. Throughout this whole movie they had this whole thing with Raven and Hank, and the minute Hank turns into the Beast, just suddenly it feels like that thing wasn't important anymore and it all focuses on the main plot line, so it felt a bit odd how they just ditched it like that, but nonetheless, a superb movie. But you know what that means? Coming in at first place is Logan, Wolverine and Professor X's send-off, and besides the Deadpool movies, the only other X-Men movie with an R rating. Just felt so free, all felt natural, felt like it was in a real world. It takes place in this future where all mutants are pretty much dead and there's not very few left and they're being hunted. And you've always wanted to see Wolverine go berserk, maybe cut some people's heads off, but it always seems to cut away or is done at an angle where you can't really see it. But in this, you get to see everything, and I absolutely loved it so much. We deserved a movie of this caliber with Wolverine going this berserk at least once, and we got it, and I couldn't have asked for any better type of movie. Just the way you can tell both of the main characters are sick and slowly dying, it felt very emotional, perhaps one of the more emotional movies in this franchise. It really is heartbreaking to see the condition they're both in, and I know mutants aren't a real thing as we know of, but it makes these characters feel more real and more relatable, that they can actually die, they're not invincible, and the way it ended, I couldn't have asked for a better ending. So that was my ranking of all the X-Men movies. I'm gonna chuck up my score on the screen so you can look at that. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.